Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Um, is it better? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to try to keep the introduction for this panel short so we can delve into quite a timely and important discussion today. We are here in the presence of esteemed scholars who are focused on international relations in their research. I'll quickly just introduce them and give a little bit of an introduction, and we will begin our discussion. I have the pleasure of sitting next to Dr. Annette Freyberg-Inan, Professor of International Relations at University of Amsterdam. Dr. Kamran who is a professor of associate professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, and Dr. Shabnam Holliday, who is an associate professor in international relations at the University of Plymouth. As you have seen in the brochure, the title of today's discussion is The World Unmade, the Middle East and the New International Order. Today we will explore the changes reshaping the global power structure, and we will try to particularly focus on the Middle East and Iran in the second half of our discussion. And then we will open for Q&A after that, hoping that we can have a vibrant conversation. As we navigate a world marked by geopolitical realignments, contested norms, and emerging multipolarity, the Middle East stands at a critical intersection of transformations. Today, we will discuss some of these complexities, explore the risks and possibly the opportunities, I don't know, and consider what this unmaking or remaking of world order means globally, regionally, and locally for specifically the context of our discussion, the Middle East and Iran. With that, allow me to open our conversation with a first question for all of our panelists, which is essentially the title of today's panel. What does the world unmade evoke for you? Evoke for you, especially on a global scale at first. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I feel very much the odd one out here because I am sitting here as someone who has no specific expertise on the Middle East or Iran. I'm a generalist in international relations, and what I can contribute, I think, is the disciplinary expertise of general international relations and a view from the outside as someone who's actually much more familiar with European and North American perspectives. Azadeh has asked us in advance to reflect on a number of questions, and I picked two of them to speak about today. The first really general one to kick off the conversation is, what does the world unmade evoke for me globally and in the context of the Middle East? And the first thing that popped to mind when I heard that phrase, the world unmade, was the first stanza of William Butler Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. And I'll do him the honor of quoting just the first 8 lines. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. These lines are quite frequently quoted these days. I don't know if you've noticed, and that's no coincidence. This poem was written in 1919 in Ireland. Yeats saw human history as a series of epochs. He called them gyres, like in the first line of the poem. And at the time he was writing, it was World War I was just over and the Irish War of Independence was just beginning. He expressed in verse a sentiment that I think is widely shared again today, namely that an old order is dying and a new order is yet to take form. And of course, you could say that in a trivial sense, that is always happening. But it seems that human beings have a sense of critical moments in processes of historical change. And it seems like now is such a critical moment. And the conference organizers have summed up the key changes that we're experiencing in a way that I actually found quite useful to structure my comments. First, war has returned not as an anomaly, but as a renewed political strategy. Second, democracy faces mounting existential threats. Three, the media, once a guardian of truth, arguably, is now a contested battlefield. And four, global powers realign in an increasingly fragmented world, and Iran stands at a crucial crossroads. I'll say a few words about each of those challenges and changes. First, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a turning point for generalized expectations from major powers regarding their use of war as a tool of statecraft. It was Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian military theorist, who said about 150 years ago that war is a continuation of policy by other means. While with the foundation of the League of Nations and later the United Nations, the international community decided that it shouldn't be. And it's important that that was a decision made by humans. As the famous constructivist international relations scholar Alexander Wendt put it, anarchy is what states make of it. So it was decided after World War II that wars of aggression should be heavily sanctioned, that they should be unthinkable for civilized actors. And of course, they continued to occur occasionally anyway, but when they did, it was a big deal. And that's something that's changed since 2022. The civilized actors, for whom wars of aggression were supposed to be unthinkable, have become despondent, and Karl von Clausewitz is back. For the field of international relations in which we work, that means that the school of thought called realism is once again gaining dominance over, broadly speaking, liberal theories that dominated after the end of the Cold War. But it would be wrong to accuse realists of being warmongers because we have to distinguish between diagnosis and prescription. Realist IR scholars mostly don't advocate the use of force. They're quite careful with that. But they do teach us to expect it. And that has a cost because it keeps in place the most tragic feature of the international system, the security dilemma. Si vis pacem para bellum, goes the Latin motto. If you want peace, prepare for war. Arming yourself makes you more secure, right? But the problem is that at the same time, it is very easily seen as threatening by others. And in this way, it increases the risk of war, making you ultimately less secure rather than more secure. And of course, that is something we can see also in relations between Iran and Israel. For realists, there is no way out of this dilemma. It's a fact of international life, at least as long as there's no effective, powerful enough authority above the level of the nation state. And such an authority seems farther away now than at any time since the creation of the United Nations. So no wonder we are concerned. The second global challenge the conference organizers have identified is that democracy faces mounting existential threats. I might add, where it even exists, because we might well ask, does democracy exist in the US where money plays such a large role for access to political power? Does democracy really exist in the European Union where important supranational institutions are only indirectly democratically accountable? The quality of democracy has been eroding in many established democracies for quite a while. But there are two more recent developments that make us more concerned now than we have been. And the first is the clearly increased and still increasing dissatisfaction with real existing democracy and plummeting lack of trust in the established political elites in many countries that are formally democratic. And this dissatisfaction and lack of trust make people become vulnerable to populist appeals and create societal polarization. A lot's written about that. I don't need to repeat it here, but the point I want to make is that this rise of populism should be seen as a backlash against liberalism. If you listen to the rhetoric of the far right in countries like the United States, Poland, or Hungary, that rhetoric suggests that liberalism itself has become a force that works against freedom. And this turns the world of ideas, the world of political ideas, onto its head. Trump is basically saying that we need autocracy to set us free from liberalism. Liberalism being associated with the elites of the past. And this is really odd, right? This is very odd that liberalism is being reframed as anti-freedom. And it remains odd even if one shares the criticism that some groups in liberal society have become a little too dogmatic about their own values. We're at a point in time, I think, where those who still hold liberal values dear really have to work to defend them. It's not to be taken for granted that liberalism will win. And the second new problem is massive interference from outside countries in political contestation within countries, the problem of foreign meddling. Influence from outside destroys the conditions required to hold elections on a level playing field because financial and technical know-how from outside can flood the political and media spheres with advertisements for specific forces, creating bias. Plus, of course, they can spread misinformation and propaganda. And the risk of outside interference as such is nothing new. Of course, that's always happened. But now there are new technical means that allow it to happen much more cheaply and on a much larger scale. And this creates a dilemma, and maybe the real problem is that dilemma. We need to have elections if we want to have democracy, and we need to be able to respect the results of elections. But of course, we shouldn't respect the results of elections that were not fair because they were tampered with. But at the same time, we have to be careful that the possibility of interference is not used as an excuse, either not to hold elections in the first place or to not recognize the result if we don't like it. And this is a real dilemma. So I don't have the answer to that one. So I've now reached the third change identified by the conference organizers. The fact that essentially the media, as we knew them, no longer function to enable us to live in the same world, essentially. Because of the rise of social media and the personalization of media consumption, people have gone into their various media bubbles and can hardly be reached anymore by information, like the outputs of science and qualitative journalism. Either they don't see such journalistic coverage to begin with, or if they see it, they don't believe it if it doesn't fit their already pre-existing views. You might say that people can no longer be reached by the facts. And as a result, increasing numbers of people even doubt whether there are facts. This is an epistemological problem, but it's also a psychological problem because people can't live like that ultimately. So it makes them seek new anchors, new sources of certitude. If you don't get your certitude by finding out what the facts about the world are from the media, you're looking for certitude somewhere else. And last, I'm about to conclude. The fourth change we have are the shifting global power relations. And shifting global power relations are not in and of themselves necessarily a bad thing. That depends on where you stand. But it means instability. And instability means unpredictability. And people don't like unpredictability. They tend to react to it with fear. Of course, changes that happen in the distribution of power and the patterns of interaction in the world can also be objectively bad for specific countries, like being attacked by Israel is objectively bad for Iran. But besides this, the increasing role played by fear in contexts of unpredictability in this region and everywhere is also a problem in its own right. Because foreign policy driven by fear is not rational foreign policy, and people governed by fear are not free people. And that's a point I'll come back to in the second round, but I'll pass it on to the next speaker now. Thank you.
All right, so okay, sound okay? Okay, great. First of all, I'd like to thank Iran Academia for inviting me and hosting me. It's been an absolute privilege to be part of this conference and the Just Peace Festival. As we are all finding at this political juncture, it's very difficult to know where to start, especially in terms of reflecting on world order and disorder. So like Annette, I've tried to use the themes of the conference, and this has fed into some of the questions that we've been asked to refer to by Azadeh. The nature of world order is being debated, as Annette has highlighted, and we've seen this morning and yesterday how polarized and polarizing media reports have contributed and continue to contribute to creating world disorder. My response to this is through my own academic writing, and I explicitly work towards increasing the presence of Iran in the discipline of international relations, using critical frameworks as a means of highlighting complexity. I do this through two particular frameworks, global historical sociology and global IR. Amitav Acharya's global IR project, which is now prevalent, is specifically related to world order. It calls for the appreciation of the agency of global South actors to construct world order and accept that it's not just the so-called West that acts. Significantly, this intervention has legitimized the inclusion of so-called non-West voices in international relations. Global historical sociology, put forward by Julian Goh and George Lawson, and also builds on the work of Kamran and many others, is based on the assumption that domestic and international politics are interconnected, and that we cannot look at these spaces in isolation of each other, and we should highlight transnational connections. And of course, historical contexts, in the plural, are absolutely essential. This therefore highlights the importance of multi-scale approaches. I have been drawn to these approaches because of the othering of Iran from both traditional and post-colonial IR spaces. Examples of this over the past 20 years are a failure to appreciate the complexity of the Islamic Republic regime, let alone Iran, and disbelief that Iranians can believe in democracy, let alone enact democracy. I've even been told that Iranians who believe in democracy must have been hegemonized by the West. I've found myself needing to stress so many times the very basic issue that Iranians and all their diversities of the agency to both think and act. So I've been asking myself, why is this the case? And I keep coming back to the same issue. I feel it's because of Eurocentrism and the binary constructions that come with it, and in so many cases are so ingrained. Alongside that, it's very important that we do not generalize the West, and it is essential to be specific when we talk about actions and actors in international relations. So this is a long discussion in relation to world order and the way that policymakers, both in Europe and the USA, have been critiqued through literature regarding the use and the perhaps contradictions of the norms and values associated with a liberal world order. Because these values are not seen as relevant to the Middle East and so-called non-West. These values include notions of progressive politics, human rights, democracy, and international law, which have been discussed in great detail over these past 2 days. And certainly there's a substantial debate among both the so-called global South and global North scholars rejecting the usefulness of the notion of West and non-West and the problematization of this binary construction. Yet, at times of political crisis, as we currently witness, the polarization of so-called West versus non-West in terms of who can have ownership over ideas of democracy and human rights becomes particularly prevalent and once again informs policies that construct world order. So what can we do about this environment? Firstly, for me, I think it's really important that in IR, and also certainly in foreign policy circles, that we acknowledge that it's not just governments that construct world order. And if we go back to the issues of domestic and international spaces being interconnected. Fred Holliday argued that we should pay attention to the ideas of revolutionaries. And I don't want to go into a debate about defining revolution just now, but they give us a frame. But this is important because he argues that they give us a framework, an idea of the indication of not only of desires for new domestic political orders, but also aspirations for international political orders. And in my view, this can also be applied to social movements. And this brings me to the theme of the conference. As has been so eloquently expressed during this conference, the ideas articulated by our social movements in Iran put forward aspirations for world order. And as Turaj Atobaki reminded us yesterday, Iran has a long history. The most recent is the Jina uprising, which we are familiar with. So what I would like to say is that at this moment, before we go into the next round, it's really important to stress, as the agents of civil society and social movements do themselves, but it's the responsibility of analysts such as myself and those working in international relations to stress the transnationalism and interconnectivity across borders and across spaces. And in our situations of crises of disorder, it's all the more important to do this. So even though many world leaders seem to have forgotten about human rights, democracy, and international law, or never wanted them, social movements across the globe show us that peoples in their diversities do and can construct and demand more inclusive visions of world order. So in the current context, we need to appreciate the agency of Iranians to decide their own futures, both in terms of domestic and international political borders. Thank you.
I think I'm going to start.
Having a hard time hearing.
Okay, hi everyone. Sound, I think, is all right, yeah. So many thanks for being here after 2 days of panels. We are in difficult times. We are caught in a war between two states, one of which is widely considered by academics as well as international lawyers to be a colonial genocidal state breaching almost every single international law. The other is a oppressive state which is based on gender apartheid, national oppression, and political repression involving systematic application of state violence for the past 46 years. And both states want us to think like George Bush did, either with us or against us. And I think in that context, we are doubly indebted to Iran academia for bringing us together in this safe environment to reflect on both wider context of this war, as well as deeper explanations for it, so that we can think beyond this dualistic logic and think about ways forward beyond this dualism. With this introduction, I want to say that I really don't have any speech as eloquent and coherent as Annette and Shabnam. Like most of you, I have been following news nonstop. But originally, I was ambitious enough or foolish enough, whichever you like, to try reflect on the two terms of our panel's title, The World Unmade, from perspective of international political economy. So what I'm going to do, or try to do at least, is first to say a few words about what is this world which is being unmade, and then say a few words about what this unmaking involves. And I want to do so by using a very well-known concept of Marxist theory, the idea of conjuncture, which put forward by Gramsci, but also advanced and enhanced by late Stuart Hall. So for those of you who are not familiar with conjuncture, conjuncture refers to a historical moment in which multiple ideological, social, economic, and political forces come together to bring about a particular configuration of power. So the conjuncture I want to talk about has two dimensions. One is the intersection of rise of China with neoliberal reconstruction of world economy, and the intersection of this coincidence with the implications of a war on terror after the 9/11 attacks. So the first part of the conjuncture. So, and here I'm talking out of my depths in IPE terms. The world which is being unmade effectively is what political economists would call embedded liberalism based on multiple principles: open international markets, national policy autonomy, embeddedness of market, multilateral institutions, and capital control. Effectively, embedded liberalism tried to combine elements of centralized planned economy, welfare state, full employment, certain control on foreign investment, and so on, with capitalist logic of production for sale rather than for use. Probably one of the most important elements of this might be the embeddedness of the markets. Markets in this form of political economy is not self-regulated, but it's actually embedded in social and political institutions of a given country, and states have significant control over their national economies. Now, this was set up originally, obviously, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the United States was leading force in creating this international political economic order. And it served the United States' interests because by far it was the most advanced industrial economy, and it was effectively benefiting from these institutions. However, this order by late 70s was exhausted in terms of capital accumulation, experiencing crisis, and so on. And that's the moment that's usually seen as neoliberal restructuring. But this coincided in real time with the takeoff of Chinese economy, i.e. its industrialization. With the opening of China and after Mao's death, there was this opening of Chinese economy to capitalist world system. And this had enormous implications because Chinese industrial takeoff coincided in real time with a restructuring of world economy, which amplified by multiple times the impact of Chinese massive entry into world capitalist system. And because China is such a massive country, the impact of Chinese economy to enter a world capitalist economy was at least tripled because of three factors. China enjoyed what Trotsky calls privilege of historic backwardness because it had access to the latest products of information revolution in the West without having to go through the process which produced it. This was combined with what is called as second unbundling, the notion that because of information revolution and technological revolution, you could actually control complex processes of production at distance without losing control. And this allowed for economic sectors to be dispersed around the world. And of course, capital chased cheap labor, which China had in massive amount. And there was a second element which amplified the impact of Chinese industrial takeoff, which was that because of neoliberal restructuring of world economy, trade was at its most open in terms of barriers. And that meant that China from very beginning was able to actually become an export economy and have a huge export profile. So this meant that the rise of China led to if you like, a deindustrialization of Western capitalist countries' heartland. And research shows that actually the vote for Brexit in the UK and for Trump in the US more or less coincides with those areas in these countries which were deindustrialized and were subject to unemployment because of rise of Chinese capitalist economy. Now, all of this, the rise of China, the move in the West from heavy industrial production to digital revolution and so on, intersected with the geopolitical implications of war on terror. As you know, after 9/11, United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. That in itself, actually, I would probably disagree here with Annette. I think the fact that war became, justified more than before, maybe already started before Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nevertheless, in 2000, United States was importing around 60% of its oil from the Gulf states. And by 2015, United States was actually a net exporter of oil. This had massive implications because historically, United States implication in the Middle East was to secure its energy supplies. With the decline of oil import from the Persian Gulf, the security arrangement, which was set in place since after Second World War, came to change. We saw that, especially in 2019, in my view, when the United States did not react to Iranian attack on Saudi oil installations. And this meant that Arab countries relying on the United States before, in the previous period, had to think about their security beyond the United States. And I think that's where you see why these countries began to approaching Israel for the so-called Abraham Accord. And at the very same time, and that's another axis of these geopolitical circumstances, is that the Arab Spring brought about revolutions in multiple countries, as you know. And in the case of Syria, as you know, it led to a civil war in which Islamic Republic played a key role in propping up the Assad regime. And this, although Iranian state depicted as a defensive war, as you know, was effectively seen as an offensive by Israel. At the same time, as the Arab countries were approaching to Israel as a backer, as a supporter against the Iranian threat, as they perceived, Hamas perceived that that Palestinian issue is being pushed away from international agenda, and therefore launched October 7th attacks. This had massive implications for Israeli perception of security and the methods by which it wanted to secure its security. So it was no longer threat or active threat which Israel was reacting to, but capacity to threaten Israel. And this, we see this in its actions in Lebanon and in Syria and now in Iran. So I think I would stop here and come back to the Middle East element later on. But I think this is the broad context: the rise of China, the shift in the Western capitalist heartland in terms of its economic arrangement, which led to this mercantilist, protectionist, America first, make America great again kind of policy, and of course Brexit in the UK and so on. And at the same time, we have this shift and transformation of security structure in the Middle East, all of which led to a massive uncertainty, insecurity, and more ease with which states resorted to arms for solving their security problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us quite an insightful overview and helping us frame the discussion. A lot of food for thought, especially for many of us who find ourselves sort of caught in the middle of a lot of things that seem like concepts and theories, and then they play a big role in your personal lives, in your generation, and all of that. So thanks for that. The second round of questions, I would like to start with Dr. Freyberg-Inan on a particular question we discussed, and then we can move on to a more regional and country-specific discussion, if that's okay. I would like to ask you about what alternative visions or principles might lead to a more just and inclusive global engagement, and also in our region, which we will discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This seems to work better. I want to make 3 points in reaction to this question. The first is that a problem from which Iran also suffers, but not only Iran, is that in ordinary discourse on international politics, as well as in the discipline of international relations, states are typically equated with governments. We just use the name of countries to refer to the agents who act internationally on behalf of that country, which is their governments. And this is pernicious, actually, that we're not more careful in the way we speak about these agents, because we should decouple states from governments to better understand international behavior. A guru of the discipline of international relations was the neo-realist Kenneth Waltz, and he distinguished between what he called the three images of international politics. Image one, or the lowest level, is the individual. What type of individual are we dealing with? The political leader. The second is the type of regime. How is the country organized? And the third image is the nature of the international system in which the country acts. And we know in the discipline of international relations that the second image, the type of regime, matters. For example, autocracies behave differently when they are at war, because the survival of the governing elite in an autocracy sometimes literally depends more directly on foreign policy success. This is the case in Iran, but it's also the case in Israel now, because Netanyahu has maneuvered himself into a position of an autocratic leader. In democracies, it typically plays out a little differently, because governments are usually formed of shifting coalitions, and that allows elites to survive, or at least later return to power, even if they have failed. They're not so directly dependent on the success of their foreign policy ventures. A second positive effect of understanding state and government as separate is that it can actually reduce the risk of conflict by identifying problems that we have with a specific government rather than with the state more generally. It matters whether we think there's a problem with the Trump government's policy or with the United States writ large. It matters whether we think there's a problem with Iran writ large or with the Islamic Republic. And one way to think about this is that mixing up state and government invites conflict from the second image, the level of domestic politics, to the third image, the level of international relations. So you're creating international conflict out of domestic conflict by not making that distinction. Diplomacy has actually evolved as a practice, as a skill set, precisely to avoid that problem. Diplomacy is a tradition of civility and formality that tries to look beyond the specific people in power at any given time and their ultimately fleeting priorities to the need to get along with the polity in the long run. That's why diplomats are trained not to react to the fact that they may have a real dislike of the person in front of them or the particular regime or governmental coalition they're dealing with. They're asked to look beyond the government to the state. And the upheaval caused by the Trump administration, since he's been in power again, is in good part due to his refusal to play by these diplomatic rules of the game. He doesn't do that. What he's producing is a throwback to diplomatic immaturity. And that is not in line with anything any international relations model would advise. My second point for an alternative vision is that we should abandon the notion of fixed national interests. It's both misleading and problematic. Interests, as well as the rank orderings between different interests, are always changeable. Even the interest of survival, which is typically considered the most basic interest a polity or a person can have, even that is sometimes set aside for a different goal. And we need to understand interests as amenable to change. which is what the constructivist turn in international relations has taught us. It's drawn attention to how interests are always, at least in part, socially constructed. So states, like people, can influence each other and pursue different interests, or to change the priorities they grant to different interests, because there's always more than one. This is what allows ultimately for international socialization and integration, and what increases the probability of successful cooperation. If, by contrast, we get stuck, we assume fixed core interests among the actors, then we can get stuck when those interests appear in conflict. Then we can't see a way out of those opposed conflicts. And this is the way the regimes of Israel and Iran have become stuck at this point. But it should be where negotiations begin, not where they are abandoned. And lastly, I want to come back, like I promised, to the problem of fear, because I think it's important to see that Israel is deeply trapped in what international relations scholars called the lack of ontological security. And this has roots in the historical experience, of course, of the Jewish people, as well as in the geopolitical situation of Israel as a state, and in the conflicts in which Israel has been involved since its foundation, and active since its foundation. Another way of saying it is that a pervasive sense of insecurity actually defines what it means to be an Israeli Jew. And it's quite difficult to let that sink in, but I think it's important, because this insecurity is doubly pernicious. It's pernicious because it brings Israel on a collision course with perceived threatening others inside and outside the country. And it's pernicious because in such a situation, it's very difficult not to stand together as one, as a sort of us against the enemies all around us. And that creates such enormous pressures on democracy. It kills democracy. It allows Netanyahu to get away with things his citizens would otherwise never have let him get away with. And a further tragic aspect of such an ontological insecurity trap is that the rest of the world getting upset at Israel's government and what it does is only going to make it worse, actually, because it creates even more insecurity within Israel. And this is an extremely difficult situation. What I would be really curious to hear from my fellow panelists who know more about this, and everybody here, is how that compares to the situation in Iran. Because I've read many comments in the past few days where people were saying, who is being bombarded doesn't make a revolution. Like, while you're being bombed, you're not going to rise up. But if we take a more long-term view, Iran, of course, has been isolated, ostracized, vilified, sanctioned by many and important other countries for decades. This is the othering Dr. Holliday just talked about. How has that contributed to the ability of the regime to stay in power and to carry out its foreign policies against both domestic and international resistance? And where does that leave us now?
Thank you very much. So partly in response to that question, and also partly on reflections about what we are seeing in the region and how we address it, I just want to remind us of a period in Iran's history not so long ago, which is often referred to in terms of the Green Movement. So I've done some work on this. What I did was I worked starting with the democracy movement leading up to 2009, and then also what's come to be known as the Green Movement following 2009. I mapped a lot of statements and ideas that I could find about that context alongside the statements about sanctions and also the sanctions regimes, which at that point changed from unilateral sanctions regimes to multilateral sanctions regimes, primarily in response to Iran's nuclear program, but also in response to the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, but also in response to the Islamic Republic's relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, the wider context of this is really important, is that this is referred to, this period we see is broadly known now as the period of the War on Terror, which followed the 9/11 attacks, and Iran was dragged into that in 2002, the axis of evil speech by President George W. Bush. So in that environment, we have a very intense situation in the Middle East. In George Bush's speeches, he equates the Islamic Republic to Hamas and Hezbollah as part of an Islamist network of terror. But also what we see during this time is following the presidency of Khatami, we see in Ahmadinejad's presidency an intensification of the democracy movement. And many of those people who were involved in that process are in this room, and I feel very humbled to be in this environment, is that there was a call for a rejection of sanctions regimes and also warmongering, and referring to this period as a time of peace, neither peace nor war. And one of the things that is really important, and this is why I want to raise it now, is that for two reasons. First, is that we see the connectivity between democracy and sovereignty. And what we're seeing now in Iran in the context of this new war is that there's a real feeling that you cannot achieve an organic democracy in a situation of war. Okay. The other thing that I want to mention is that, and I can go into the theoretical sort of framing of this later, or on another occasion. But what we see, what I call, is a contradiction of the values associated with the so-called Western liberal world order. Because at that point, in the name of the Western liberal world order, so that is the EU, the US, sought to restrict the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. But by doing that, they also restricted the evolution of organic democracy in Iran. And that is a really important thing that we need to appreciate in allowing, that's why I call for a really important approach where we appreciate the interconnectivity between domestic and international politics and have multi-scalar analyses. So when we're looking at this current situation, we need to look, as you suggested, at what is Netanyahu's relationship with Palestine, Netanyahu's relationship with Israelis, as well as the historical context, and also the Islamic Republic's relationship with its people as a broader framework of analysis. Thank you.
So would you like? Yeah. Well, I had planned to speak more specifically about the Middle East and Iran at this second round, and I want to highlight the peculiarity of state formation in the region, including Iran, and how this affects foreign policy and the use of foreign policy for domestic purposes. To elaborate on this, I would like to borrow from Ian Lustig, whose work I use in my teaching. He has an article which addresses the question, why is there no great Middle Eastern power? And the question seems to be very pertinent because if you look at the Middle East, I mean, if you take out Iran and Turkey, most of it's Arab, Muslim, Sunni. Why 20 Arab states and not a single Arab state, as Pan-Arab Project would have wanted to be? And his argument is based on the notion of historical sequence, meaning it makes a massive difference at which point in modern history the modern state formation begins in a particular geography. So European states began their state formation in 16th, 17th century at a time when there was no international legal system. There was no international power able to exercise its force well beyond its borders in a systematic way. So war of conquest, taking over others' territories was a sort of normal process of state formation. But by 19th century, this has changed with the rise of industrial capitalism in Europe and growth of international legal institutions. elites in previously imperial formations who wanted to make modern nation states could not act the way the earlier European state formers had acted. And he provides really interesting examples, 3 of them, in fact. Muhammad Ali in mid-19th century in Egypt wanted to create a great Middle Eastern state, but as soon as it was able to advance in Syria and the Levant, a joint force of French and British intervened and on behalf of the Ottomans actually destroyed his army. And the other example he gives is Saddam Hussein, in fact, in 91, taking over Kuwait. Again, another form of state formation, which was trying to replicate original European case, but it wasn't allowed because there was United States, United Nations, international law, and so on and so forth. So this is one side of belated form of state formation. If you come late in history, you face a kind of barriers which the earlier states did not face. But this has another aspect which I think is particularly important in case of Iran and, in fact, other parts of the Middle East. And that is that in late nation-state formation, state always comes before the nation. And because there is no existing web of capitalist social relations to create an organic interaction and interconnectivity through a market and also trade as a national economy, elites in countries like Iran and Iraq and Syria and elsewhere had to construct the nation around culture rather than actually social institutions. And that itself was a recipe for disaster because there were multiple cultures in these countries, and therefore elevating one of them involved effectively repressing the others. And that created a series of centrifugal nationalist movements which required systematic deployment of violence and force by these states. And a violent state cannot be democratic by definition if it acts internally. This also means that often these states lacking legitimacy internally, precisely because nation formation is so state-led, they have to create that legitimacy by creating crises or ambitious agendas beyond their borders. So post-revolutionary Iran, the idea of an Islamic Ummah and Islamic revolution without borders. As you know, IRGC, Sepah Pastaran, does not have the word Iran at its end. So it can go anywhere, basically. So these states constantly need to create an ontological insecurity in order to mobilize and regiment people within their countries by depicting this impending disaster outside their borders. Iran will become Assyria. That was the refrain of Iranian statesmen. And yet Syria was exactly what Iran created to a large extent by help of Russian deployment there. So what you see is a pattern of externalizing internal crises. You have a crisis of legitimacy, crisis of economic equality, all these promises which Islamic Republic delivered at its inception, none of which is deliverable. So what do you do about this? Well, war and tension, constant tension with the United States, creating this almost inexplicable hostility towards Israel, purely on, even in ideological terms, doesn't make much sense really. But that is the instrument by which then internal dissent is repressed. And another example is actually Libya. I was telling, I think, Shabnam yesterday that Libyan state's legitimacy was entirely based on its international agenda, not on its internal development. So helping IRA, the Palestinian groups, Iran, and so on and so forth. So this constant pushing outside your internal crises in order to justify the use of force is a sort of self-propelling logic, which can create consequences beyond what these states intended. I think the current war, at least partly, if not entirely, obviously, can be explained in the sense in which basically Islamic Republic overplayed his hand in thinking that it can constantly play on the brink, and somehow the other side is not going to be, doing preemptively, especially with a state of Israel, which, as I think Annette referred to, suffering from is ontological insecurity and a quite transformed collective psyche after October 7th, its appetite for risk-taking, its disregard for international law and legal system. I don't think the Iranian side sort of taken into account what massive change had happened in the Israeli society following October 7th. So I'll stop here.
So I'd just like to say one more thing, going back to the importance of social movements and highlighting the norms and values. The social movements that we see, so leading up to the Jina uprising, the woman life freedom protests in Iran, are a rejection of gender-based, religion-based, class-based and ethnicity-based violence. This is not unique to Iran. We're seeing protest movements and social movements across the globe. And while people say that the liberal world order has ended or that it is failing, what we're seeing is bottom-up aspirations for a liberal world order whereby progressive politics, democracy, international law are still extremely important and aspired to. So in terms of thinking about how we change the state of our world order and move towards more inclusive politics, it's really important to highlight those voices, and it's the job of analysts. And we talked about, what is good journalism, negative journalism, etc., and also transnationalism to make sure that those messages are heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really impressed by how on time we are with our original plan. So I think now we can open it to question and answers.
There's one there.
Yes.
Takes a bit of time.
Usually Western media talks about proxies, and Iran lost its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, right? Even though Iran had so many crises financially because of the internal and the sanctions, right? Why they didn't avoid this crisis, and they had the chance to have an agreement, but they knew it is very serious, and Israel is very aggressive towards its neighboring countries. They have been attacking Syria and Lebanon. Why they refused to sign the agreement with the Trump administration? Thank you.
Happy to answer. Do you?
I could.
Right.
You start and then
I thought we were collecting more questions. Well, I think they were trying to agree, right? Israel attacked before the last meeting, but they were quite reluctant. I think I might be wrong. It's early days. We don't know really what happened behind the scenes, but I think Iran's calculation was that Israel cannot and will not attack without US, and US or Trump is. He came to power on a platform of no more wars, and without Trump really committing to an invasion like 2003 in Iraq, even if Israel attacked from aerial attacks, they would survive. So I think probably they misread the situation. We still don't know. I mean, US may not actually enter the war, and Iranians might turn out to have been right about it. But it's also true that it's quite difficult for Israelis to stop at this point. So much depends on the balance of power, I guess. But yeah, or the original thing I was misreading of the situation.
I'd just like to say something about the word proxy. So I actually think this is a really problematic term because it suggests that a certain type of power relations is taking place. Certainly there is a relationship between, and a very close relationship between the Islamic Republic, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, etc. But when we refer to it in terms of proxy, it suggests that one will do the bidding of the other. So they will do the bidding of the Islamic Republic. But ultimately, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, they are all also nationalist movements with their own particular understanding of their own idea of nationalism. They are not necessarily there for the sake of the Islamic Republic. So they will they will act in what they perceive to be their own interests, which may not be agreeable, obviously, to people in Palestine, Lebanon, etc. But so the term itself, proxy, is a really, really problematic term. And perhaps what we're seeing now is actually miscalculation because we've been so obsessed with the word proxy. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. So my question goes back to the title of this panel, which is The World Undoing. And this term for me reflects on the Trump's inauguration party that we see a lot of tech companies, corporations sitting in an inauguration room and getting their pedestal. And that narrative has been growing as his administration continues his aggressive policies towards different components of the economy that exists in the US and worldwide. And also we hear a lot about the fall of an empire and the rise of a new one, which some people indicate is going to be corporation-based, borderless, and changing the world order in that regard. I wondered what's your thought on that is.
I can start. In a way, there's nothing new under the sun, but of course, the circumstances are very different. Trump is basically running a neo-mercantilist foreign policy. So he is engaging in what might be called a nationwide public-private partnership with those companies and funders that he can get to align with his agenda in order to raise the economic power to carry out his political agenda worldwide. And this is not qualitatively very different from the age of colonialism. I'm at the University of Amsterdam, and sometimes our ceremonies take place in a room called the Heren 17, the 17 Lords, which were the CEOs of the Dutch East Indies Company, who were the Elon Musks of their time, you could say, carrying out the bidding of the Dutch kingdom all over the world. And I find it very strange that we see this coming back now, but in a way, this is what I see coming back, even if it's no longer going to be Elon Musk personally, perhaps, but the trend continues in the United States. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I mean, the fall of empire, I'm afraid it might be a bit too early to say that. What I wanted to actually say in the first part was that part of what I wanted to say was that the more China overtakes economically United States, the more United States relies on its superior military force to maintain its hegemony. And this has created obviously a huge debate in IPE around whether a rise of China is really peaceful, as the Chinese say. They might want it to be peaceful, but the other side may not be very open to it. So when the United States disengaged from the Middle East after 2011, when they withdrew from Iraq, the foreign policy was described as pivot to the east, right? So the entire focus of the United States military and its alliance with Australia and the UK is to contain China in that part. So what I'm trying to say that U.S. empire, I'm not sure it has fallen or it's clearly in decline in historical terms. But the very fact that we're entering this really unstable and volatile situation is precisely because that imperial formation is feeling the danger of falling behind. And this always increases the reliance on military force. And you might be actually witnessing an element of that in what's going on at the moment in Iran.
Hi. I guess my question includes like three of you, I guess. So you already mentioned as the end of the American world order, like by Acharya, and also I guess you already mentioned the erosion of democracy. Peter Mayer also has a book on it, Ruling the Void. My question, and what surprised me is that these discussions has been predicted, and these are not newly discussions. The books and all the discussions has been like clearly been stated for about 2014 and or something. So my question is like EU clearly know about that some things are changing, and we are slightly moving to a multiplex world order. While I believe they have been so much dependent on the United States foreign policy, and they decided to remain passive to the whole changing. I don't say that EU had to stop the changing, but it seems to me that they didn't decided to adapt to the whole changings. And they slightly seems to me that they decided to have reactionary foreign policy to the things that were happening in different crises and regions. For example, uh, if I want to give one example, the EU foreign policy became active again in the terms of Ukraine and Russia when the United States decided to go onto like Trump administration decided to become active on the matter of the Russia and Ukraine. This is also somehow the same in the matter of Middle East, in the matter of Syria. So I don't know if you agree with me or not, or you might be you might disagree with me, but to me seems that EU and mostly EU and Western countries, mostly in the Europe, they have been mostly passive in all these changing. I don't know if you might say that it might be because of the democracy and the transnational like entity of the EU, that it has lots of stakeholders and lots of interests that are involved in that matter. Yeah, thank you.
Did the panel get the question?
So I think she's. Sorry.
I think you're absolutely right that the European Union and European Union member states reacted only very sluggishly to changing regional and global circumstances. But it's interesting because I work quite a lot on Central and Eastern Europe, and with people from Central and Eastern Europe, colleagues, there is a clear difference there. So especially when it came to anticipating Russian aggression and preparing for it, there were many warning voices coming from Central and Eastern European member states saying, you know, please do something, wake up, we have to prepare. And Western Europe didn't react, which was very frustrating. But there's reasons for that, of course. The Western European Union member states were under the so-called U.S. security umbrella, right, since the end of the Second World War, and that was a very convenient situation for them because the United States did bear the bulk of the costs of their defense, and facilitated the process of European integration because European Union member states didn't have basically externalized their security worries and could focus on maximizing prosperity through continuing integration. And then, of course, the signs started piling up that, you know, the U.S. security umbrella is having holes in it, becoming threadbare, and maybe you need to go stand on your own feet more. But at the time, of course, by that time, given that it had been decades, strategic cultures had evolved in those states that were not, you know, they are sticky. And the institutions are sticky and the budgets are sticky. And at that time, it was clear that changing course would cost a lot of money. It would be very unpopular with the voters because the voters didn't want to spend more money on defense in important member states like Germany. It's still quite unpopular. And it wasn't seen as sufficiently necessary because the crisis wasn't there yet. So basically, it kept being postponed, I think, for those reasons. And it took this wake-up call to do the, what did the German chancellor call it at the time? Zeitenwende, to produce that turn of the tides that we've seen now. But I agree, it was very late.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but just remember this the line by E.P. Thompson in his book called History of Germany or something like this. The first line is that 1848 was a turning point. Germany failed to turn. So yes, I mean, states take time, institutions are heavy moving, but as Annette said, yeah, they were having this easy ride with the United States. So I think they are only beginning now to think beyond the United States.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I did like say something that was in same category as the gentleman before me, and because that I am to another question. I heard about international order. In real politics, we don't have order. International politics is anarchic. And we can see 75 years how is West countries busy with the global South. Because that, I don't believe in order. That is their order to take everything from several space in imperialistic and neo-colonialistic way. Another word is Middle East. I believe that the language is not only our expression, but same time is the designing of our thinking. Middle East is the look of colonialistic countries to East. We are geographic West Asia. We are not Middle East. That is a cadeau. I hope that you don't use Middle East to us. No, that was.
I just want to say some word what Dr. Martin said. The main focus on Trump's policy is to reduce China's influence in the region. And this is why he is very interested to bring even the Islamic Republic of Iran into the board in terms of Western Hemisphere. The other thing is that Trump wants, regarding the Ukraine war, he is in direct contact with President Putin. And President Putin has difficulties to negotiate with European countries. So that President Trump knew that. And he knows that the Russia is currently very close to China. Now, bringing a kind of agreement with Putin means that the Putin needs the Western IT technology, and the Trump needs the access to natural resources in Russia. And this is also the main interest of the both, to bring actually Putin back to the Western Hemisphere. So I think the Trump's administration's policy is quite clear, and this is why until today, even Israel wants to involve the military action of the U.S. Army in attacking Iranian nuclear powers and military bases. And this is, I think, he's hesitant to do that and wants again to reduce the Chinese influence in the region.
Any other question? No?
Thank you very much. Any reactions to the comments made?
Do you want Annette?
Well, maybe only to say that the sense in which I use the word order is that there's a pattern structure that provides some stability and predictability that doesn't bear any positive connotations, and order can be terrible. Just to clarify that. But I have a question as well, if I may, to bring us back more to the present and perhaps the future in Iran, because I read a very interesting article by Bali Nasser in Foreign Affairs recently. And he describes the constant power balancing that's been going on in the region of West Asia, and claims that now Iran and the Gulf states need each other, and both sides need a nuclear deal. So the Gulf states have the opportunity to become the pivot of a new regional order, as he puts it, if the US pursues a nuclear deal, and not a confrontational strategy with Iran, saying effectively that there's a shared, possibly broadly shared interest in a negotiated solution involving Iran, the US, and the Gulf states. And I wonder what the experts here think about that argument.
No?
I was just going to say something about order and Southwest Asia, because I think it's a very, very important point, and I'd like to acknowledge that that's an important point. So I've actually changed the module that I teach. Now I no longer refer to it as the Middle East, I refer to it as order in South Asia. And as to defining world order, I should have said that I see this in terms of the institutions. They're not necessarily successful, but there are institutions. And more importantly, in terms of norms and values, which may or may not be liberal. These are the binary. And that, for me, it's important to acknowledge non-state ideas of how we would like our world order to be. As for the regional dynamics, I could only say that historically, until this moment, I would say that there has been a competition in the region. All of these states, the main actors in the region, Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Erdogan's Turkey, and Netanyahu's government in Israel, all seek, in my view, regime survival, and that they will, because they are all challenged domestically, and that their actions will be either in that whether domestic or regionally, will be for the aim of regime survival. As to what's going to happen now, I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few words about, because you mentioned order and anarchy. I think what is really remarkable about modern world order is that it involves formal political equality of states. So, I don't know, Gabon is a member of the United Nations, so is Russia. Massively different countries. And yet the same world order is based on hierarchy in economic and military terms. So what is, I think, fascinating about how capitalist world order works is that it brings together hierarchy and anarchy at the very same time. And whenever anarchy dynamics threatens the hierarchy, force comes in, whether legal or illegally. So that's very, very different from previous imperial, I think, orders. In terms of Valina's article, Annette mentioned, I think he has a point in terms of, the degree to which Gulf states have got this, huge trade relations with China, they would benefit from stability and not war. But I think deep down, they really like Iran to be, at a minimum, entering that arrangement in a junior as a junior partner rather than having its own regional hegemonic aspirations. So I don't think they wouldn't mind if US and Israel would, degrading Iran massively if the flames of the war doesn't reach them. But Iran constantly threatens that they would attack U.S. bases which are in those countries, as if U.S. comes in. I think these countries did the same with respect to Gaza. So in open discourse they would, condemn Israeli actions, but multiple sources suggest they were actually pushing Israel to be as harsh as possible against Hamas. So. I would be quite cautious about what these states really say, as opposed to what they are doing behind the scenes.
I shouldn't ask so many questions, but a quick follow-up to what you said, Kamran, and what Annette is asking. Do you see any role in the movements, like grassroots movements that exist in Iran, in bringing these Arab countries to negotiation table with the Islamic Republic? For example, 6 months after this Women Life Freedom movement, we saw the negotiation between the Saudi Arabia and the Iranians that started like out of the blue. Do you see any relations for that or not? And then I'm going to pass it to you.
I think that really was not so much about the pressure from, that particular change. It was about how Iran was reeling from the sanctions, and the only way they could reduce that problem was to, normalize with those Arab states. And of course, China was heavily involved in that. So while sanctions continued and no deal was being made, Iran had to strategize away from Europe and the US, and that was the main thing. But more broadly, like you, I would like to see domestic social movement pressure, not just in that terms, but in terms of much more strategic aspects of Iranian social life. Why do we need a nuclear project? Well, what's the point? There is not a single megawatt of energy produced by this project, which has cost basically, trillions of dollars, right? But as you know, war usually suspends social energy at home. So we have to see what comes out of it in the longer run. But yeah, that's how I see it. Yeah.
I would like to give a response to Annette's question. I know and I do believe in this solution that the asymmetric situation in West Asia is very dangerous. Kenneth Walt has said long before that if Israel with atom bomb and no another country in the region that is continuity of this destabilization, and we have to have balance in the region, and that is the reason that Islamic Republic did develop this way, because it's dangerous for another countries. Look at the Gulf countries; there are so as a mouse. They are afraid for Israel and America. I do believe in this. Maybe whole of the Zal, because it's anti-Islamic Republic, is for everything anti-Iran. But I think we have to be strong, not with Islamic Republic, with a democratic country, but everybody has to not have kern weapons. Kern weapon for nobody. And NAFO has to be finished. We have no peace if it's NAFO, and if it's country that has asymmetrical power.
Thank you so much. We are almost at the end of our time, and I just wanted to thank you and thank everyone for all the wonderful questions. And just a final point or reflection that, when I was preparing to moderate this panel, as an Iranian who is also a global citizen, the title of the panel meant something different to me than today. And I think, you know, while you're scholars and you know, deeply sort of familiar with all the theories, and there is a disconnect between sometimes scholarship and the sentiments and the fears of and the living circumstances of people, I cannot find a more timely time for this discussion. And I think the way you discussed it is also very accessible to also non-scholars. So I really want to thank you for that as an Iranian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.